An open letter to open-minded progressives. Chapter 2, More Historical Anomalies. Mencius Moldbug, April 24, 2008. In Chapter 1, we looked at 3 anomalies in progressive political thought, a surprising definition of the word independence, an oscillatory ambivalence around the concept of nationalism, and a chiral gradient in sensitivity to human rights violations. These particular anomalies are not just progressive. They are in fact modern. They are generally shared across the conservative-progressive spectrum. They are even shared by most libertarians, except maybe the Randians, who have epistemic troubles of their own. They are simply as close to universal as it comes. Unless, of course, the past is allowed to dissent. Because when we look backward a little, we see that these ideas come along quite recently. They are fresh. Very fresh. To a progressive, of course, this is mere progress. But if you are also an evolutionary geneticist, you might also call it a selective sweep. Obviously, our anomalies have some competitive advantage. But what might that advantage be? Well, perhaps the anomalies have prevailed because, in some way that we maybe don't quite understand completely yet, they are good and sweet and true. After all, people would rather think thoughts that are good and sweet and true. They would also prefer to share such with their friends. Because it is so obvious, so elegant, and so widely believed, we'll label this the null hypothesis. I'm going to interrupt the discussion for a moment and digress. Since this is after all the 21st century, perhaps we can enliven our proceedings with a little mixed media. Here's a YouTube clip of a protester in the recent violence in Kenya. As far as I can tell, no one is harmed in this 80-second clip, but otherwise it's as dramatic as it gets. It has a talky start, a shocking climax, and a happy ending. Well, it's sort of a happy ending. At least, the blue car gets away. BTW, I lied, the protester is hard to follow, but his corner seems to be here. 1 Metro is this. 2 If you were fooled, sorry, try watching it again with this perspective. I think this clip is a good litmus test for whether you sneaked into the auditorium without a permission slip, or whether you really are a progressive. If you really are a progressive, when you try to connect the clip above, which might well have been staged, with a broad sweep of human history, you will think of Hitler or Mussolini or maybe even George W. Bush. Why? Because our protagonist is behaving exactly like them. His actions are tribal, territorial, and predatory. As one of our great Vulcan thinkers once put it, every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some small crappy little country and throw it against the wall, just to show the world we mean business. I'm sure the people who decided to invade Iraq had many goals, all of which they imagined in entirely benevolent terms. But I really have trouble believing that this wasn't at least one of them. If you sneaked in, who knows what you think? Something awful, I suspect. Kids, this presentation is not for you. Can't you just slink back to your slimy holes for once? Note to all, in case you ever find your nice, clean, progressive discussion forums overrun with Nazis, you can drive them away by making the Jew noise, yo. Yo. It's better than the mosquito. In any case, thanks for participating in our first experimental test of URTV. More videos are not coming soon. Let's get back to these anomalies. We will continue by assuming 2 things about the null hypothesis. 1 is that it's basically true. 2 is that any small ways in which it may be imperfect are, A. minor, B. accidental, and, C. either self-correcting or at least correctable. Since this is basically what progressives, and most non-progressives believe, it is only fair to start with it. It's a pity, though, that it leaves us with these odd asymmetries. It is easy to note that progressives, as well as most non-progressives, express these mental adaptations. It is hard to understand why. This is especially true since progressive thought seems to lack any sort of theology, which can explain just about anything. Why are people with red hair and blue eyes evil? Because that's how Bale made them. So our 3 anomalies have 3 things in common. 1. Progressives have explanations for all of them, but these explanations seem less than usually compelling. 2. These strained explanations are generally shared not just by progressives, but also by their enemies, the conservatives. And 3. There is a single anti-progressive hypothesis, which is obviously on its face wrong or at least incomplete, but can at least be explained in terms that do not require a gentleman to hurl his sartor resartus at his dinner companions, and seems to explain them all quite nicely with plenty of headroom left over. The hypothesis is that the international community, a phrase we see used on a pretty regular basis, although perhaps we are not quite as clear as we might be as to what exactly it might mean, is, and always has been, a fundamentally predatory force. The fact that falsifies the hypothesis, at least for me, is that my father was a U.S. diplomat, And if the international community means anything, it must mean foggy bottom. And I can tell you that it is simply impossible to mistake a transnational bureaucrat, or transy, for an SS officer, or vice versa. If the Third Reich is your image of an international predator, and why shouldn't it be? Can't we make Hitler work for us? The adjective is clearly misapplied. As anyone who has ever known any number of progressives knows, progressives are generally decent, intelligent and well-meaning people. Moreover, this fact does not stop at the edges of government. By definition, decent, intelligent and well-meaning people are not predatory. Since the international community is clearly progressive, the hypothesis is falsified. Phew. But, not endorsing this false hypothesis, but simply using it as a tool of argument, it sure is interesting to look at how nicely it explains our little anomalies. It may or may not be productive to replace 3 poorly explained phenomena by 1 incorrect assumption. But at least it reduces the number of problems. Let's work through them one by one. First, what happened to the Third World? Well, that's pretty easy. It was conquered and devastated by the international community. Admittedly, the devastated part kind of sucks. But when you're a predator, it's better to conquer and devastate than not to conquer at all, n'est-ce pas? Let's take a look at this independence thing. What exactly is a multilateral declaration of independence? Since it's not this? Well, on the sweet and good and true side, a multilateral declaration of independence seems to involve a change in the ethnicity of government officials. Foreign officials are replaced by native-born officials. Clearly, for example, it would be an outrage for true-born Americans to be governed by a dirty no-good Mex. Oh, wait. We're progressives. We're not racists. Ethnicity means nothing to us. Well, the post-colonial regimes are no longer controlled from overseas. They can do whatever they want. They're free. Sure they are. They're so free that they've received $2.6 trillion in aid since 1960. Does the phrase "who pays the piper calls the tune" ring any bells? Again, in English at least, the word independence is a compound of the prefix in, meaning not, and dependent, meaning dependent. And what does it mean for a government to be free, anyway? Is the government of North Korea free? What about ExxonMobil? Or the Democratic Party? I have a fairly good understanding of what it means for a human being to be free. When it comes to an organization, especially one which claims to be a government, I'm quite without a clue. One test we can apply for independence, which should be pretty conclusive, is that the structures of government in a genuinely independent country should tend to resemble the structures that existed before it was subjugated, rather than the structures of some other country on which it may happen to be dependent. These structures should be especially unlikely to resemble structures in other newly independent countries, with which it presumably has nothing in common. In other words, after 1960, did the Third World become more westernized or less westernized? Did it revert to its pre-Western political systems, rejecting the foreign tissue like a bad transplant? Or did it become a more and more slavish imitation of the West? There is exactly one region in which the former happened, the Persian Gulf. Not that the Gulf states are utterly unwesternized, but their political systems are clearly the least Western in the world. Oddly enough, the Gulf states also happen to be independent in the good old financial sense of the word. There are also 2 exceptions in Africa, Somaliland, which fell through the cracks, and Botswana, which has diamonds. You will sometimes hear Botswana described as a model of African democracy. How fortunate that the Botswanan people should be so wise as to elect, as their first president, none other than their hereditary monarch. In practice, the place is more or less run by De Beers, on the good old United Fruit model. Across most of the Third World, however, we see a very simple transition, from the traditional forms of government and tribal leaders whom the British, French, Rhodesians, etc., supported at a local or even regional level in the policy of indirect rule, to a new elite selected and educated in Western missions schools and universities. In Africa, these men are called the Wa Benzi. Wa is the Swahili prefix for tribe, and I think Benzi speaks for itself. Moreover, the rhetoric of Tiers Montes Mizn was almost the same everywhere. If Algeria and Vietnam were truly growing up and following their own destinies, you might think the former would be ruled by a Dey and the latter by emperors and mandarins. You'd certainly be surprised to find that they both had an organization called the National Liberation Front. And finally, perhaps the subtlest aspect of dependency is power dependency. To whom did this rash of fresh presidents, congresses and liberation fronts owe its existence? Where, exactly, did Macmillan's wind of change blow from? For that matter, who cares about all these people now? Why does a vast river of cash still flow from European and American taxpayers to these weird, camo-bedecked, mirror-shaded thugs? Well, one theory is that the brave Liberation Front seized power through their own military prowess. Or the unquenchable anger of the people at foreign domination, which could no longer be repressed. Or the fiery will of the workers, which blazed out once too often. Or the shining light of education, which brought the dream of democracy to our little brown brothers. Or, I'm afraid Professor Frankfurt has taught us much on this subject. In fact, you'll see that in pretty much every case, including some that may surprise you, here's a great primary source: the liberation fronts achieved power because they had powerful friends. Sometimes the friends were in Paris, sometimes they were in London, sometimes they were even in Moscow. But for the most part they were in New York and Washington. There's an excellent new film on this subject, from Barbet Schroeder, the man who gave us General Idi Amin Dada, reality's answer to Forrest Whitaker. It's called Terror's Advocate, and you gotta see it. Once again, if this is independence on a three-eyed donkey. Note that the English language has a perfectly good word for a regime which appears to be independent, but in reality is dependent. It starts with P and rhymes with Muppet. In fact, perhaps Muppet is a good term for the post-1945 post-colonial regimes. A Muppet state is not quite a puppet state. It delivers a far more lifelike impression of individual identity. It has not just an invisible hand supporting it from below, but invisible strings pulling it from above. In fact, Muppet states often appear quite hostile to their masters. There are a variety of reasons for this. One is internal conflict within the master state, which we'll get to in a bit, but the simplest is just camouflage. The classic story is de Gaulle's legendary obstreperousness during World War II. De Gaulle had to cause problems for the British and Americans, because his whole story was that he represented the true spirit of oppressed France, rather than being just some guy that Churchill set up in an office, which is of course exactly what he was. Furthermore, because a blatant display of puppetry would have been no use to the Allies, they had to tolerate his acting out. The phenomenon of dependent rebellion is quite familiar to anyone who has ever been a teenager, an analogy that's a good guide to the sort of independence we see in the likes of a Mugabe, a Castro, or even a Khomeini, each a member of the I Got My Job Through the New York Times Club. It's easy to see what a network of post-colonial Muppet states harnessed to the hegemonic will of an imperial alien overlord looks like. We have the perfect example, the Warsaw Pact, and its assorted flunkies in Africa and Asia. In fact, we have two evil Muppet empires to look at, because the Maoists spun off their own. The Marxist-Leninist Muppet states all insisted fervently that they were liberated, independent, etc., and that their alliances were brotherly partnerships of equals, with their own politburos and everything. And of course the whole enterprise was run by Comrade Brezhnev, from the white phone in his petty salon. Even Hitler's quislings in New Order Europe did not exhibit quite this level of gall. There was no pretense that Vichy France, for example, was an equal of the Third Reich. And since the Soviet and Western blocs often competed for the same set of Muppets, for example, Nasser, Tito, and even Ho Chi Minh, who never lost his popularity out in Langley, I'm afraid the pattern is really quite clear. So from our counterfactual perspective, the story of the Third World is quite clear. In the second half of the 20th century, the Third World passed from its old colonial masters, the British, French, and Portuguese, who were certainly no angels but who were perhaps at least a little less brazen, to a new set of ruthless and cynical overlords, the Cold War powers, whose propaganda skills were matched only by the devastation that their trained thugs unleashed. Under the mendacious pretext of liberation and independence, most remnants of non-European governing traditions were destroyed. Major continents such as Africa were reduced to desolate slums ruled by corrupt, well-connected fat cats, much of whose loot went straight from Western taxpayers to Swiss banks. What's especially interesting is that when we step back and consider the history of the non-Western world since 1500, we see a broad trend that does not reverse course at all the 20th century. If anything, the 20th century is more of the same, only more so. We see four basic structures of government: native rule with private Western trade, native rule under the protection of chartered companies or other monopolies, like the East India Company, the British South Africa Company, Anaconda Copper, etc., etc., classic nationalized colonialism with indirect rule, and the post-colonial Muppet states. Across all these stages, as time increases, we see the following trends. 1. The non-European world becomes culturally and politically westernized. 2. More and more Westerners are employed in the actual task of governing them. I don't know the ratio of aid workers today to colonial administrators 50 years ago, but I'm sure it's tremendous. And 3. The profits accruing to the West from all of this activity dwindle away and are replaced by massive losses. Aid is essentially a subsidy to the Muppet states, which are to the old chartered companies as a lot of factory is to a Honda factory. Who benefits from these trends? The international community, i.e., a vast army of international administrators who labor diligently and ineffectively at healing the great wounds they have torn in the side of the world. Who loses? Everyone else, Western taxpayers in the usual slow, relentless dribble, Africans and Asians in the gigantic revolutionary hemorrhage of civil war, poverty, corrupt government, and the collapse of medical care. If you read travel narratives of what is now the Third World from before World War II, I've just been enjoying Erna Ferguson's Guatemala, for example, you simply don't see anything like the misery, squalor and barbarism that is everywhere today. Ferguson describes Guatemala City as clean. I kid you not, what you do see is social and political structures, whether native or colonial, that are clearly not American in origin, and that are unacceptable not only by modern American standards but even by 1930s American standards. So, again, we have two theories of the international community. One, its own, depicts it as the savior and liberator of the planet, and essentially global and universal in nature. Two, the one I've just developed, shows it as a ravenous predator, the dominant player in a second scramble for Africa with Asia and South America added to the plate, essentially, a new version of the Delian League, with Washington in the part of Athens. And neither quite makes sense. The first hypothesis is very hopeful and reassuring, and most people believe it, but it has these odd, Orwellian tics in the way it uses English. And the second is, once again, quite counterfactual. I know these people. They are not at all predatory. There is no denying that transnational bureaucrats have the world's best interests at heart, and they are certainly not in any way American nationalists. They simply do not remind me, in any way, shape or form, of Corner Man. 3. So let's put this conundrum aside and move on to the second anomaly, nationalism. I hope it's not too much of a surprise that this turns out to be a special case of the first. Nationalist regimes and movements are good when they're doing God's work, i.e., their goal is to become nice, multilateral members of the international community. Nationalist regimes and movements are bad when they defy international opinion and turn against said community, which wants nothing other than to be able to love them as its beloved children. In other words, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Typical Machiavellian predatory behavior. It is always pleasant to depart from the bleak, mendacious 20th century and return to its predecessor, whose leaders could be just as unscrupulous but who dressed much better. There was an international community in the 19th century as well, and at least in the Old World, it operated out of one place, London. Quick association test. The unification of Italy, good or bad? I'll bet you said good. Well, here's a little story. A couple of years ago Mrs. Moldbug and I spent 3 weeks in Italy. For the first week we split a villa in Salento with some friends, which was lovely if a little buggy, and involved inhaling enormous quantities of limoncello. Next we thought we'd take our backpacks and bop around on the train a little. Our first stop, Naples. I'm afraid it's not for nothing that northern Italians say Garibaldi didn't unite Italy, he divided Africa. Obviously, this is a racist statement, and I can't condone it. But even the Lonely Planet warns travelers that you might think you're in Cairo or Tangier. I have never been to Cairo or Tangier, but if they are anything like Naples, God help them. The 3,000-year-old city of Naples is a reeking, garbage-ridden sewer. This year there was an actual garbage strike, but the problem is perennial. There was a giant, seemingly permanent mound of it right across the street from our LP-recommended albergo. At all times, almost everyone on the street appears to be a criminal, especially at night. The streets are ruinous, unlit, and patrolled by thieves on mopeds. We saw one pull up in front of an old lady carrying a bag of groceries, openly inspect her goods for anything worth stealing, then scoot away. Apparently they have a reputation for ripping earrings out of women's ears. From Naples you can take the Transvesuviano to Pompeii. This train has a wonderful name, but its main purpose appears to be to transport criminals from the Stalinist banlieue in which they live to the city in which they steal. Signs in every language known to humanity warn the tourists that pickpockets are everywhere. The trains are stripped to the metal and covered with graffiti, which is not in Latin. As the train stopped at one station, we saw a couple of carabinieri carrying a body bag away from the platform. The night after this we wandered the historic district of Naples, simply looking for one open-air cafe in which to sit and chat. Eventually we found one. We were pretty much the only people there. It was Saturday night. We moved on and discovered one clean thing in Naples, the new, EU-funded subway. Tried a couple of stops. Everything was the same. Finally, I remembered a snarky little use of the word bourgeois in the planet and marched Mrs. Moldbug over to the Funicula, which goes up the hill to the Vomero, a sort of internal suburb. Quelle différence! You go 300 feet up a cliff, and you have gone from Cairo to Milan. We immediately found a wine bar with an English-speaking hostess and enjoyed several lovely glasses. Suddenly we realized that it was late, and we didn't know when the subway stopped running, to get us back to our albergo, near the Stazione Centrale. So we asked. And no one knew. Not the waitress, not anyone in the bar. These hip young people had no idea of the subway hours in their own city. I believe the waitress actually said something like, "Why do you want to go there?" We hurried, and I think we got the last train. The next day, Mrs. Moldbug, who is far more tasteful than I and who would never repeat that nasty line about Garibaldi, expressed the desire to just hop on the Eurostar and stay on it until we get to Stockholm. In fact, we ended up in Perugia, which is, of course, lovely. So, Naples. Obviously, Naples being this way, I assumed that Naples had always been this way. There was that old line, "See Naples and die," but presumably it referred to a knife in the ribs. That poor bastard on the Trans-Vesuviano had seen Naples, and died. Was it worth it? So I was surprised to discover a different version of reality, from British historian Desmond Seward's Naples, a traveller's companion. In size and number of inhabitants she ranks as the third city of Europe, and from her situation and superb show may justly be considered the Queen of the Mediterranean, wrote John Chetwoode Eustace in 1813. Until 1860 Naples was the political and administrative center of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the most beautiful kingdom in the world. Consisting of southern Italy and Sicily, it had a land mass equal to that of Portugal and was the richest state in Europe. For 5 generations, from 1734 till 1860, it was ruled by a branch of the French and Spanish royal family of Bourbon who filled the city with monuments to their reign. The Borboni, as their subjects called them, were complete Neapolitans, wholly assimilated, who spoke and thought in Neapolitan dialect. Indeed, the entire court spoke Neapolitan, until 1860, glittering court balls and regal gala nights at the San Carlo which staggered foreigners by their opulence and splendor were a feature of Neapolitan life. In 1839 that ferocious Whig Lord Macaulay was staying in the city and wrote, "I must say that the accounts which I have heard of Naples are very incorrect. There is far less beggary than in Rome, and far more industry. At present, my impressions are very favorable to Naples. It is the only place in Italy that has seemed to me to have the same sort of vitality which you find in all the great English ports and cities. Rome and Pisa are dead and gone, Florence is not dead, but sleepeth, while Naples overflows with life." The Borboni's memory have been systematically blackened by partisans of the regime which supplanted them, and by admirers of the Risorgimento. They have had a particularly bad press in the Anglo-Saxon world. 19th-century English liberals loathed them for their absolutism, their clericalism and loyalty to the papacy, and their opposition to the fashionable cause of Italian unity. Politicians from Lord William Bentinck to Lord Palmerston and Gladstone, writers such as Browning and George Eliot, united in detesting the tyrants. Gladstone convinced himself that their regime was the negation of God. Such critics, as prejudiced as they were ill-informed, ignored the dynasty's economic achievement, the kingdom's remarkable prosperity compared with other Italian states, the inhabitants' relative contentment, and the fact that only a mere handful of southern Italians were opposed to their government. Till the end, the Two Sicilies was remarkable for the majority of its subjects' respect for, and knowledge of, its laws, so deep that even today probably most Italian judges, and especially successful advocates, still come from the south. Yet even now there is a mass of blind prejudice among historians. All too many guidebooks dismiss the Borboni as corrupt despots who misruled and neglected their capital. An entire curtain of slander conceals the old, pre-1860 Naples. With the passage of time calumny has been supplemented by ignorance, and it is easy to forget that history is always written by the victors. However, Sir Harold Acton in his 2 splendid studies of the Borboni has to some extent redressed the balance, and his interpretation of past events is winning over increasing support, especially in Naples itself. Undoubtedly the old monarchy had serious failings. Though economically and industrially creative, it was also absolutist and isolationist, disastrously out of touch with pan-Italian aspirations. Beyond question there was political repression under the Bourbons, the dynasty was fighting for its survival, but it has been magnified out of all proportion. On the whole, prison conditions were probably no worse than in contemporary England, which still had its hulks. What really upset Gladstone was seeing his social equals being treated in the same way as working-class convicts, since opposition to the regime was restricted to a few liberal romantics among the aristocracy and bourgeoisie. The Risorgimento was a disaster for Naples and for the South in general. Before 1860 the Mezzogiorno was the richest part of Italy outside the Austrian Empire, after it quickly became the poorest. The facts speak for themselves. In 1859 money circulating in the Two Sicilies amounted to more than that circulating in all other independent Italian states, while the Bank of Naples' gold reserve was 443 million gold lire, twice the combined reserves of the rest of Italy. This gold was immediately confiscated by Piedmont, whose own reserve had been a mere 27 million, and transferred to Turin. Neapolitan excise duties, levied to keep out the North's inferior goods and providing 4/5 of the city's revenue, were abolished. And then the Northerners imposed crushing new taxes. Far from being liberators, the Piedmontese administrators who came in the wake of the Risorgimento behaved like Yankees in the postbellum southern states. They ruled the Two Sicilies as an occupied country, systematically demolishing its institutions and industries. Ferdinand's new dockyard was dismantled to stop Naples competing with Genoa. It is now being restored by industrial archaeologists. Vilification of the Borboni became part of the school curriculum. Shortly after the Two Sicilies enforced incorporation into the new Kingdom of Italy, the Duke of Maddaloni protested in the national parliament. This is invasion, not annexation, not union. We are being plundered like an occupied territory. For years after the liberation, Neapolitans were governed by northern Padronian carpetbaggers. And today the Italians of the north can be as stupidly prejudiced about Naples as any Anglo-Saxon, affecting a superiority which verges on racism. Africa begins south of Rome, and lamenting the presence in the north of so many workers from the Mezzogiorno. The ill feeling is reciprocated, the Neapolitan translation of SPQR being Sono Porci, Questi Romani. Throughout the 1860s 150,000 troops were needed to hold down the south. Note the pattern. What made Italian unification happen? Why did Ferdinand of Naples, with his 443 million gold lira, just roll over for Charles Albert of Piedmont, with his mere 27? Two reasons: Lord Palmerston and Napoleon III. Where did exiles such as Mazzini and Garibaldi find their backers? Not in Pompeii, that's for sure. The unification of Italy was an event in the 19th century's great struggle between liberalism and reaction. The international liberal movement of the 20th century, in which a figure such as Karl Schurz could go from German revolutionary in 1848 to Civil War general in 1861, was the clear precursor of today's international community. And once again, we see it playing the same predatory role, conquering and destroying in the name of liberation and independence. Unless you count the American Revolution, perhaps the first and clearest case of this strange phenomenon, multilateral independence, was the Greek War of Independence. As Lawick, without a trace of irony, puts it, after a long and bloody struggle, and with the aid of the great powers, independence was finally granted by the Treaty of Constantinople in July 1832. Indeed. And if we look at the citizens of said great powers, principally, of course, Great Britain, who gave us Greek independence, we see the same type of people who were behind Mazzini, Schurz, and all the way down to today's international community: liberals, radicals, thinkers, artists, progressives. Lord Byron is of course the archetype. Again, these are the best and nicest people in the world, now or then. So why in the world do they always seem to turn up in the same breath as phrases like long and bloody struggle? So we have not solved the anomaly of nationalism. But at least we have reduced it to the same problem as our first anomaly, which has to be something. What happened to the third world? It was devoured by predatory, cynical, bogus nationalism. Why would educated, cosmopolitan, and civilized thinkers support predatory, cynical, bogus nationalism? Again we hit the wall. Let's move on to our third problem: Hitler. Of course I hold no brief for Hitler. Yo! The anomaly, to reprise, is that Hitler today is detested for his human rights violations, i.e., the Holocaust. And the Allies are therefore revered for defeating Hitler, wrapping the whole problem up in a neat little bow. The only problem with this human rights theory of World War II is that it has no resemblance to reality. First, the Allies included a fellow whose human rights record was at least as bad as Hitler's. Second, Roosevelt and Churchill not only didn't seem to much mind the extermination of the Jews, whom they had many opportunities to save, if anything, they covered it up. Which makes neo-Nazi claims that the Holocaust was Allied war propaganda grimly comical, to say the least. And third, the Allies didn't at all mind barbecuing as many enemy civilians as they could fit on the grill. Put these facts together, and the human rights theory of World War II makes about as much sense as the suggestion that Caesar invaded Britain because he wanted to see Manchester United play Chelsea. So why did it happen? The nominal cause of the European war was that Britain wanted to preserve a free Poland. You'd think that if this was their key goal, they would have found a way to come out of the war with a free Poland, especially having won, and all. Much the same can be said with respect to the US and China. Note that what we are interested in, here, is not the motives of Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo. These men are dead and so are their movements. The movements that defeated them, however, live on. I think it's pretty clear that the international community and the Allies are one and the same. Our question is why said community had such a harsh reaction to Nazi Germany. Especially since its response to Soviet Russia, which was just as aggressive and just as murderous, was so different. One simple answer, continuing our counterfactual, was that the fascist movement was a competing predator. Perhaps the Allies destroyed the Nazis for the same reason that a lion will kill a leopard, if it gets the chance, not because leopards are all that good to eat, but because there are only so many antelope in the world. Unfortunately, the waters here are freshly muddied by Jonah Goldberg's half-educated bestseller, which argues that fascism was really a left-wing movement. Erich von Kuhnelt-Ledeen, a far better writer, made the case far earlier and far more eruditely. He was still wrong. As a reactionary Jacobite myself, I feel it's especially important to face up to the basically reactionary nature of the fascist movement. Fascism and Nazism were certainly creatures of the democratic era. Nothing like them could have been imagined in the 19th century. They certainly borrowed many techniques of government from both liberals and Bolsheviks. And the experience of living in a totalitarian state does not much depend on whether that state is communist, fascist, Buddhist or Scientologist. Nonetheless, Goldberg is wrong, there is a fundamental difference. In the 1930s, there was no confusion at all as to whether the fascist movements were parties of the extreme right or of the extreme left. Everyone agreed. They were parties of the right. Populist right-wingers to be sure, but right-wingers nonetheless. For once, the conventional wisdom is perfectly accurate. For example, in 1930 Francesco Nitti, nephew of a liberal prime minister by the same name, published a book called Escape, about his escape from internal exile on an Italian island. Let's just say that it wasn't exactly the Gulag. In the preface, his uncle the PM explains Mussolini for the English-speaking reader. Mussolini represents a medieval adventure in Italy. Until some 15 years ago, communist and anarchist, he defended regicide, anarchist crime, political assassination. He has written and predicted individual revolt. He has always considered all religions, these are his very words, like opium, to lull people to sleep. He has written and repeated for 20 years in his discourses that the abyss between capitalism and the proletariat should be filled with the heads of capitalists. Again in the year 1920 he incited workmen to occupy factories and to pilfer. In 1914 he laughed at the Belgian occupation and urged the Italians to rebel against those who wanted to drag them into the war. Which all sounds very well for Goldberg's thesis. But wait! Not having succeeded in making a red revolution, he attempted a white reaction, taking advantage of the discontent after the war. He succeeded with the help of a few generals and part of the army who wanted reaction. Becoming dictator, Mussolini has not only forswore all his past, but has introduced the most terrible reaction. All form of liberty has been suppressed, press liberty, association liberty, reunion liberty. Members of parliament are practically nominated by the government. All political associations have been dissolved. For those not versed in the color symbolism of 19th century Europe, white is the color of reaction, just as red is the color of revolution. Thus, Nitti is telling us, unlike the old socialist Mussolini, the new fascist Mussolini is a reactionary. Just like the Borboni. As we've seen, if the international community is a predator, reactionaries are its prey. So, while the Soviets might be seen as a competing predator, fascism is something quite different. Fascism is a species of prey that, unlike the Borboni, decided to fight back. And it was not exactly averse to fighting dirty. Here is my perception of fascism. It was a reactionary movement that combined the worst ideas of the Ancien regime, the worst politics of the Democrats, and the worst tyrannies of the Bolsheviks. And what was the result? It is every bit as vanished as the Borboni. For a reactionary, fascism is more or less a short course in what not to do. Even a lifetime later, our emotional responses to fascism and Nazism make these concepts very difficult to handle. Full disclosure, my grandfather, a Jewish communist, enlisted in the US Army to kill Nazis. And I'm pretty sure he bagged a few. One way to step away from these associations is to look not at the Third Reich but at the Second, the strange regime of Kaiser Bill, and the war he made. A less loaded name for fascism might be neomilitarism. The ideology of Wilhelmian Germany was generally described as militarism, a perfectly accurate description. It was certainly reactionary, and also quite populist, for a monarchy. World War I was extremely popular in Germany, as in all countries. Under the Kaiser, the highest social status available was conferred by military rank. You might be a distinguished professor of physics, but if your reserve rank as a military officer was low or, worse, non-existent, no one would talk to you at parties. Even for Americans who know something of the military, it's almost impossible to imagine living in a true militaristic society. Why did the last survivors of the Ancien regime become so aggressive and militaristic? Why, for example, did the German military jump at the opportunity to start a war in 1914? Because they believed our counterfactual, that the international community was a killer with fangs. The German theory in 1914 was that the British alliance with France and Russia was designed to encircle Germany, not exactly implausible, if one glances at a map. And we have already seen how the British dealt with reactionaries when they got the chance. The theory of the German General Staff in 1914 was that Germany, surrounded and besieged, had to attack or it would be gradually choked to death. This bit of Nazi propaganda from 1939 explains the German militarist theory of modern history quite well. The deepest roots of this war are in England's old claim to rule the world, and Europe in particular. Although its homeland is relatively small, England has understood how to cleverly exploit others to expand its possessions. It controls the seas, the important points along major sea routes, and the richest parts of our planet. The contrast between England itself and its overseas territories is so grotesque that England has always has a certain inferiority complex with respect to the European continent. Whenever a continental power reached a certain strength, England believed itself and its empire to be threatened. Every continental flowering made England nervous, every attempt at growth by nations wanting their place in the sun led England to take on the policeman's role. One must understand this to make sense of England's German policy from Bismarck to our own day. England was not happy with the results of the War of 1870 to 1871. British sympathies were already on France's side, since for the previous 100 years it had never had the same fear of France as it had of Germany. France had secured its own colonial empire, and its shrinking biological strength left enough room for expansion within its own natural boundaries. Things were different in Germany. England knew that the German people were strong when they had good leadership, and that nature had given them limited, resource-poor territory with a limited coast. Great Britain kept an eye on Germany, all the more whenever Germany expressed its strength, even in the most natural ways. The Second Reich experienced England's balance of power policy. We know that England did not want a true balance of power. It wants a situation in which England is always in a position with the help of its allies to have its way with a minority of confident, forward-moving nations. Obviously, this is propaganda. But one bit of real history that I can recommend to anyone is the viewpoint of the fellow on the other side of this encirclement business, Lord Grey of Faladon. If you've ever wondered who said the lights are going out all over Europe, we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime, Lord Grey is your man. His memoirs are extremely readable, indeed, reading them one sees just why we have not seen the lamps lit again. There is simply no individual of Grey's caliber, politician or civil servant, in the whole government racket these days. Needless to say, to Lord Grey, writing after the war, no one would ever dream of trying to encircle Germany. Rather, the German militarists are paranoid and jingoistic, constantly trying to enhance their domestic political position by triggering European crises. And indeed the pot that boiled over at Sarajevo was by no means the first such crisis. Agadir is a fine example. The British, on the other hand, are simply doing their best to keep the peace. In the end they failed. Germany attacked Belgium without provocation, and British honor bound her to respond. I find Grey completely credible. I have no reservations about his sincerity. He certainly strikes me as a far more trustworthy character than the slippery Palmerston, who really was a bit of a snake. And his summary of the causes of the war is peerless. After 1870 Germany had no reason to be afraid, but she fortified herself with armaments and the Triple Alliance in order that she might never have reason to be afraid in future. France naturally was afraid after 1870, and she made her military preparations and the dual alliance with Russia. Britain, with a very small army and a very large empire, became first uncomfortable and then, particularly when Germany began a big fleet program, afraid of isolation. She made the Anglo-Japanese alliance, made up her quarrels with France and Russia, and entered into the Entente. Finally Germany became afraid that she would presently be afraid, and struck the blow, while she believed her power to be invincible. Heaven alone knows the whole truth about human affairs, but I believe the above sketch to be as near to a true statement of the causes of war as an ordinary intelligence can get in a few sentences. And yet, did Germany, or more precisely the Hohenzollern monarchy, have no reason to be afraid? The Bourboni were certainly caught napping. And note that, while Germany was challenging British naval hegemony, the overdog remained Britain and the underdog Germany. Who, exactly, had more reason to be afraid of whom? Grey is not exactly shy in waxing Palmerstonian about the contest between democracy and reaction. We had no thought ourselves of going to war in 1914 because we supposed that sooner or later we should have to fight. We just strove to prevent war happening at all. But when, in spite of our efforts, war came, it is well that we took our place in it and at the outset. The latent forces at work became apparent as the war proceeded, and the incidents in which the war originated were forgotten as these forces were revealed. It was a great struggle between the culture that stood for militarism and the free unmilitarist democratic ideal. It was the perception of this, whether consciously or unconsciously, that brought the United States into the war, the United States, which as a whole had cared little about the incidents that caused the war at the outset, and which did not as a whole then perceive it. But it was the perception of it, revealed to us as the war developed, that made us know that we were fighting for the very life of what Britain and the self-governing dominions cared for. We could not have escaped that struggle between militarism and democracy by turning our backs on the war in August 1914. The thing would have pursued us until we had to turn our backs and face it, and that would have been when it was even stronger and when we had become weak and isolated. Who sounds a little paranoid here? The British Empire covered the globe. The forces of democracy and liberalism were clearly on the advance. Reactionary militarism was beleaguered. Did it absolutely have to be utterly crushed, right then and there, bang? Note that for most of World War I, it was Germany who wanted peace on the basis of the status quo, and the Allies who insisted that Germany be defeated and militarism eradicated. Perhaps Hitler considered his war a crusade to stamp out democracy forever, but the Kaiser did not. His opponents, however, felt no such compunctions. Gray reproduces a memo from his ambassador in Washington that states the basic German perspective, as of September 1914. German ambassador has stated in press that Germany is anxious for peace on basis of status quo, and desires no new territory, but that England has declared intention of fighting to finish for her selfish purposes, and is consequently responsible for further bloodshed. Gray responds, Germany has planned this war and chosen the time for forcing it upon Europe. No one but Germany was in the same state of preparation. We want in future to live free from the menace of this happening again. Treitschke and other writers of repute and popularity in Germany have openly declared that to crush Great Britain and destroy the British Empire must be the objective for Germany. We want to be sure that this idea is abandoned. A cruel wrong has been done to Belgium, an unprovoked attack aggravated by the wanton destruction of Louvain and other wholesale vandalism. What reparation is Germany to make to Belgium for this? Is Gray's real concern reparations to Belgium more or less a British client state? Clearly it is not. His concern is setting a condition that the German militarists cannot accept without losing face, because his objective is to crush Germany and destroy the German Empire. As he wrote in early 1916, nothing but the defeat of Germany can make a satisfactory end to this war and secure future peace. We must, however, be careful in stating our determination to continue the war to make it clear that our object is not to force, but to support our allies. Increasing mischief is being made between us and our allies by German propaganda. This propaganda represents the war as one of rivalry between Great Britain and Germany. It insinuates that France, Russia and Belgium could have satisfactory terms of peace now, and that they are continuing the war in the interest of Great Britain to effect the ruin of Germany, which is not necessary for the safety of the Allies, but which alone will satisfy Great Britain. It is just possible that this insidious misrepresentation, false though it be, may create in France, Russia, Italy and Belgium a dangerous peace movement, a movement positively unfriendly to us. It would be well if we could all, ministers and press alike, strike one note, that of determination to help the Allies who have suffered the most grievous wrong, to secure the liberation of their territory, reparation for wrong done, and the advantages necessary for their future security. We should emphasize the impossibility and disgrace of thinking of peace till the Allies are secure, but should let it be understood that it is for them whose territory is occupied by the enemy, whose population has been, and is being, so grossly ill-treated, rather than for us, to say when it is opportune to speak of peace. Till that time comes, we use all our efforts and make every sacrifice to defeat the enemy in the common cause, and have no other thought but this. Can you make this stuff up? We're fighting for the sake of the Allies. If they would prefer peace, it is their place to speak of peace, not ours. But let's make sure we don't let them think it's okay to think of peace, because Germany must be defeated. It's especially important to counter the insidious German peace propaganda, which may lead our allies to think we can only be satisfied by the defeat of Germany. Which is nonsense, we're only fighting to redress the wrongs to our allies. Again, I am not sure these excerpts really convey the flavor of Lord Gray's thinking. Obviously I am not presenting it at its best. I really do find Gray a congenial character, as I'm sure I would not find, say, Ludendorff. It is simply impossible to think of him as a predator. And yet once again, it is difficult not to see the fangs. In any war, each side presents itself as the injured party, and the other side as the aggressor. Is Germany trying to crush Britain? Or is Britain trying to crush Germany? Or are they both aggressors? Again, we are in an impasse. We have a very tempting theory that seems to explain all of these anomalies quite neatly, but the theory is obviously not true. Reject it, however, and the anomalies are back, and they seem to have friends. What to do? Footnotes. 1. The clip actually depicts an American vagrant who violently defends a street corner in Las Vegas, Nevada. 2. Metro is a slang term for the Las Vegas Police Department. 3. That is, the violent vagrant from the video referenced above.